As we near the end of the semester, we are going to take a look at some different levels of ecology out there. And as you can see from this figure, we can really look in biology at a variety of different levels out there. We've looked at the atomic level, and we've looked at some of the cells that are out there. And we're going to take a look at tissues and organ systems in the next level. But here we're really going to focus on this idea of ecology, which is really the scientific study of interactions between these organisms and their environment. And if you think about what can have an impact on an organism, we sort of divide them up into two different ways. One of them is what's known as biotic factors, so impact from the organisms that are located in that area. But also we can look at the abiotic factors, so chemicals and physical factors that can affect how these organisms are distributed in the environment. So think about things like nutrient availability. Remember, all organisms are going to need carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then some of those trace elements. But also remember, one of the major ways of classifying organisms was looking at their carbon and their energy sources. So what can you do to actually get access to that carbon, and what is your source of energy is going to play a big role in an organism's interaction with the environment. We can also look at things like temperature, availability of light and water, and all that kind of stuff that's out there. So we're going to consider some of these different factors and what role they play when we look at ecology out there. And if we look at these different levels of study of ecology out there, you can take a look at the individual organisms within an area, and there you're doing organismal ecology. And really what you're looking at is evolutionary adaptations that these individual organisms are going to have to meet really the challenges posed by their environment. So primarily you're looking at these abiotic factors that are affecting the individual organisms. And if you work your way up, you can take those individual organisms that are out there and start to consider them as a population. And population ecology is going to look at groups of these individuals that are the same species and living in the same area. And if we look at population ecology, you really have to think about what kinds of factors can influence this population of all these same kinds of organisms living in an area. And what they're going to look at is things like population density, what's known as age structure, or how many different organisms in different age groups are out there, and also consider things like survivorship and the growth rate of that population of organisms. We work our way up again and go from population ecology to community ecology. And now you're not only looking at the population, but now you're looking at all of the populations that are living in that particular area. So you're going to start to examine how these species are affecting the other species in terms of their organization in that area. And if we go all the way up to the top of this for our ecological studies and we look at ecosystem ecology, now you're looking at interactions between these different communities in a specific area. And when you look at this, you're starting to focus on things like how does energy flow from something like producers to the consumers out there, and also starting to look at the recycling of chemicals. And so now you're bringing in not only abiotic factors, but also biotic factors, the influence of other kinds of populations and communities of organisms that are living in that area right there. And overall, when we can look at everything on the planet, now you're starting to consider the biosphere out there. And when we look at this idea of ecology, one thing is a lot of people look at that ecologists are going to be the tree huggers out there, and really that is sort of a misnomer from some fake news out there. When you're looking at ecology, this is not the same as an environmentalist. We do understand a little bit more about these environmental problems when we look at ecology, and here's a good sort of example. If you look at the oceans that are out there, the water in the ocean actually starts to circle around and around because of the currents that are there. And if you look in the Pacific Ocean over here, you can actually find an island of trash that is in the middle of the ocean, and this island of trash out here is about the size of the state of Texas. So you're looking at something that is 270,000 square miles of trash, and we can see in this picture this guy that is basically paddling through. So imagine driving for hours and hours through trash in the surrounding neighborhood. Well, that's what we have in the middle of the ocean. And this is a big problem that people want to try and not only clean up, but we have to consider what impact is all of this trash having on the life in the oceans, and think about what impact that's going to have on us and our future and our availability of food and other kinds of things that we would get from the ocean. So we're going to start off looking at some of the different parts of ecology associated with the population level. And remember, when we're looking at population ecology, we're looking at things like the size and the number of different kinds of organisms that are living in a certain area with just one type of organism out there. And when you do this, you basically go out and you sample the organisms that are out there, and you try and estimate the numbers, because counting every single organism is going to be a little bit difficult there. So you would really go out and count sort of like a sample or a representative portion of these organisms, and then use that to make inferences about the population as a whole. And we can see this in our own society when we do something like the census in the U.S. We don't count every single person. We count a sample of that and use that to infer what's going on with the population. And when we look at this idea of measuring the population size, this does actually have to be tailored to the organism that you're studying. If you want to count the number of fish that are out in a lake, you're not going to be able to get every single fish that is out there, but you can try and do things like how many fish do we have in a cubic kilometer, so you could measure some of the fish that are coming in and out, or try and trap some of them in a given area. Plants are obviously a little bit easier because they don't move around as much. So you would look at something like the number of trees in a square kilometer in a forest. With microbes, now you're running into a whole different problem just because of the size of them. So your scale is going to be different. You're going to be looking at the number of, say, worms in soil, and you're not going to be looking in a kilometer, because obviously that's going to be difficult. So you could look at something like a cubic meter of that soil and how many worms that are out there. Because really, when we look at it, it's really impossible to count all of the individuals in that population. So you would often estimate these from indirect indicators. You could look at, say, the number of bird nests that are in a field, or the number of rodents that are in burrows. And if you calculated the number that you would find in one, then you can multiply that by the number that you find overall and use that to really estimate the numbers for that population. And when we look at this sort of figure here, people have gone out and done counts and looked at different populations of organisms and found that they do tend to fall in these different kind of categories that are out there. So you can see sort of a random distribution versus a herd of animals over here where they tend to be clumped. And then if you look at our nice little penguins over here, you can see they're sort of uniformly distributed. So for these kinds of things, you would want to measure the population using a variety of different methods. With the flowers over here, you could drop down a square and then use that to count the number of individuals that lie within that square, and use that to infer the total number of things that are out there. For something like these guys, where you're looking at organisms that are moving, oftentimes what they'll do is mark and recapture kind of experiments. So when we look at this, not only are we looking at population size, but you're getting some idea about the distribution of the species. So are they living in different kinds of patterns? And that's going to tell you something about the organism that you're looking at right there. And we can see an example when we look at this figure right here. It's showing you the relationship between the size of populations of organisms and their density. And if you think about this, you could sort of make a hypothesis in terms of the bigger the animal, the more resources are going to be necessary, so you would expect them to be less dense. And if you look at this, what you can see is as you increase your body size here, you do actually have a smaller density of these organisms on average here. This is sort of a best fit line that we're looking at here. So we can use this data to really start to characterize the population by looking at the number of individuals and then those number of individuals in a unit area. So this population size can really affect the population as a whole, and again start to look at these evolutionary adaptations that are going on, because if you remember, when we look at a gene pool for a population, that is giving us some idea about genetic variation that is in that population of organisms. So if you think about this density that we're looking at right here, this is really going to affect some of the interactions within that population. These individuals are going to be competing for the resources that are available out there. So things like food, space to live, ability to find a mate. And if you have a smaller organism, they tend to be a little bit more densely distributed than those larger organisms that are out there. When we look at this idea of population studies for ecology, what they're basically doing is using statistics and some mathematical tools to start describing the population and start to learn a little bit about how they change. And this is one example with a life table over here. These are also known as mortality tables, and if you're in the insurance business, it's known as an actuarial table. And what you're looking at is basically a population of squirrels up here in the Sierra Nevada mountains and looking at what's going on with their population. So starting to learn a little bit about the number of them that are out there, their age for reproduction, how many of them are actually alive, how many of them are dying during the year, and getting some idea about the population as a whole. And so these are sort of life history traits that can tell us something about that population of organisms. And if you look at these two groups right here, what we can see from this is there's something that is affecting the males in that population, that they are not living as long as the females. So right off the bat, we can see that something interesting is going on in terms of the death of a certain portion of that population that is out there. Another kind of example that we looked at in lab is this idea of survivorship curves, where you're examining that distribution of individuals according to their age. And so this is sort of taking that actuarial table or that life table and starting to plot some of these numbers out to compare them. And when you look at this, we found that there was 3 basic types of survivorship curves, where you're really looking at the mortality over the lifespan of these organisms here. And we saw that example in lab. Your type 1 kind of survivorship curve, you have a few kids out there, and we find this mostly with mammals. You produce a few offspring and you provide good care to those offspring, so you increase their likelihood to survive to the age of reproduction. And here we can see with humans, we survive much longer compared to these other 2 kinds of curves. When we look at our type 2, now we're looking at a good example of this would be bird populations. And here, really your death at any age is equally probable. And then our last one that we see down here, very characteristic of a lot of trees and also marine invertebrates that are out there, is you just have a bunch of kids and very few of those are going to be able to survive through those first few years or the first few months of life, depending on what you're looking at in terms of the lifespan over here. And then over time, some of them are going to be able to survive and they have a whole bunch of kids. But you can see after a certain age, you sort of pass that cusp where now you're much more likely to survive and you produce those large numbers of offspring that are out there.